Well, the story you think you know is only part of the truth. This wasn't some grand, calculated political decision. It was, for all intents and purposes, an accident. The historic event that signaled the end of the Cold War wasn't triggered by a great leader's decree or a secret diplomatic deal. It was triggered by one man fumbling an answer at a live press conference. This is the incredible story of how a single monumental blunder, broadcast to a nation hungry for freedom, unleashed a chain reaction that nobody could stop. For 28 years, it was a scar on the face of a city, a brutal line of concrete and wire that sliced through streets, homes, and even hearts. The Berlin Wall stood as the most potent symbol of the Cold War, the physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain that divided a continent. It was built with chilling efficiency, guarded by soldiers with shoot-to-kill orders, and seemed like a permanent fixture of the world. And then, on the night of November 9th, 1989, it just fell. Not because of an invasion, a treaty, or a planned demolition. It fell in a chaotic, euphoric, and utterly bewildering rush of people. How? How did a fortress that defined an era crumble in a matter of hours? The why? A divided world, a concrete scar. So, how did we get here? How did a wall end up cleaving a city in two? The story begins in the ashes of World War II. After Germany's defeat, the victorious Allies, the US, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, carved the nation and its capital, Berlin, into 4 occupation zones. But as the wartime alliance soured and turned into the Cold War, that division became permanent. In 1949, 2 German states were born. The American, British, and French zones became West Germany, a capitalist democracy. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, a communist state under Moscow's thumb. But Berlin was the strange exception, an island city deep inside East German territory, yet itself divided. West Berlin became a glittering outpost of Western freedom and capitalism. East Berlin was a different story. The state promised a workers' paradise, but delivered economic stagnation and the pervasive surveillance of the Stasi, its infamous secret police. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and for East Germans, the open border within Berlin was a wide-open escape hatch. Between 1949 and 1961, an estimated 3.5 million people, a staggering 20% of the GDR's population, voted with their feet. This wasn't just an embarrassment. It was a catastrophic brain drain that threatened the very existence of the East German state. So the regime, backed by the Soviets, decided to build a wall. Propaganda called it the anti-fascist protection rampart, claiming it was to keep Western spies out. But everyone knew its real purpose: to lock its own citizens in. In the dead of night on August 13, 1961, the operation began. Workers unspooled miles of barbed wire and tore up streets, severing the city. Families were split apart in an instant. The Bernauer Strasse became infamous for its tragic scenes, as buildings on one side of the street literally became the border. Desperate people jumped from their apartment windows into the nets of West Berlin firefighters, until the regime bricked up the windows for good. The concrete scar was drawn, and for the next 28 years, it would only get deeper and more deadly. The how, the evolution of the death strip. The first barrier was crude, but what it evolved into was a masterpiece of oppressive engineering. The Berlin Wall wasn't just one wall. It was a complex, multi-layered system of fortifications that encircled West Berlin for nearly 100 miles. By the time it reached its final form, in the mid-1970s, known as Grenzmauer 75, it was an almost perfectly designed prison. Imagine trying to cross it. First, you'd have to scale an inner wall, or fence. Then, you'd find yourself in the death strip. This wide, floodlit corridor of raked sand was designed to show footprints, giving a clear line of sight to guards in the hundreds of watchtowers. It was a terrifying gauntlet, filled with obstacles like steel anti-tank Czech hedgehogs and beds of nails sometimes called Stalin's carpet. Further on, you might face an anti-vehicle trench. And if you made it past all that, you would face the final barrier, a 12-foot-high wall of reinforced concrete topped with a smooth, rounded pipe to make it impossible to get a grip. All of this was overseen by guards in over 300 towers who were ordered to shoot to kill. While automatic firing devices and landmines are deployed along the larger inner German border, they were not used on the Berlin Wall itself. Despite all this, the human desire for freedom is a powerful thing. Over 5,000 people managed to escape, using ingenious and desperate methods. They dug tunnels, hid in secret compartments in cars, and one pair of families even built a homemade hot air balloon and sailed to freedom. But for every success, there were countless failures. At least 140 people are confirmed to have been killed at the Berlin Wall. Their only crime, a desire for liberty. Chris Geffroy was the last person to be shot and killed trying to cross. In February 1989, just 9 months before the wall would cease to matter, it seemed an immovable part of the landscape. But by the late 1980s, powerful forces were beginning to crack its foundations. The turning point: cracks in the Iron Curtain. For decades, the Cold War was a rigid stalemate. The Soviet Union crushed any attempts at reform in its Eastern Bloc satellite states. But in 1985, a new kind of leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in the USSR. Facing a collapsing economy, Gorbachev knew things had to change. He introduced glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, a restructuring of the system. Crucially, he also signaled a massive shift in foreign policy. The Soviet Union would no longer use its military to prop up communist regimes in Eastern Europe. He jokingly called it the Sinatra Doctrine. Each country could now do it their way. This was a green light. Across the Eastern Bloc, long-suppressed reform movements began to stir. In East Germany, citizens in Leipzig began gathering for peaceful Monday demonstrations in September 1989. At first, there were just a few hundred people chanting, "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. But the crowds grew week after week, swelling into the hundreds of thousands. The pressure cooker really started to hiss in the summer of 1989 when Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating the first tier in the Iron Curtain. Tens of thousands of East Germans, who were conveniently on vacation in Hungary, flooded across into the West. The GDR was hemorrhaging citizens again, and this time the wall was being bypassed. The East German regime was paralyzed. Its hardline leader, Erich Honecker, was out of touch. The tipping point came on November 4th, 1989, when up to 500,000 people gathered in East Berlin's Alexanderplatz for a pro-reform demonstration, which was broadcast live on state TV. The people were no longer afraid. The government knew it had to do something, and fast. A committee hastily drafted a new law to ease travel restrictions, hoping to placate the masses. It was this poorly communicated law that would set the stage for one of the greatest blunders in modern history. The climax, the press conference gaffe. Now we get to November 9th, 1989. The man at the center of the storm is Gunter Schabowski, a mid-level party boss recently made the government spokesman. He was tired, overworked, and most importantly, he'd missed the meetings where the new travel law was finalized. That evening, he was holding a routine and, frankly, boring press conference. Just before he went on, a colleague handed him a 2-page note about the new travel rules. He glanced at it, but didn't read it closely. The government's plan was to announce that, starting the next day, November 10th, East Germans could apply for visas to travel. This was meant to be an orderly process, a safety valve to release pressure, not break the dam. Near the end of the press conference, an Italian journalist asked about the travel law. Schabowski, remembering the note in his pocket, shuffled his papers, and started reading the text he'd barely scanned. He announced that East Germans could now apply for private travel abroad, and permanent departures would be allowed through any border crossing. The room was suddenly electric. Reporters shouted questions. "When does it take effect?" someone yelled. Shabovsky, flustered, looked at his notes. They didn't say. This was the critical missing detail. Looking up, confused, he shrugged and uttered the words that would change the world. Das tritt durch meine Kenntnis ist das sofort unverzüglich. As far as I know, that is immediately, without delay. Stunned silence, then a mad dash. The reporters knew exactly what they'd heard. Within minutes, the news was rocketing around the globe. West German TV, widely watched in the East, led its 8 p.m. newscast with a sensational headline: GDR opens border. Now, this wasn't actually true, the gates weren't open. But in a country simmering with decades of frustration, perception was about to become reality. The people's response, the unstoppable wave. The news hit East Berlin like a shockwave. At first, people were skeptical. Could it really be true? Cautiously, a few dozen people walked to the nearest checkpoint at Bornholmer Strasse. They asked the guards, who had no idea what they were talking about. They had received no new orders. The officer in charge that night was Lieutenant Colonel Harold Geiger. He'd seen the press conference and was furious, calling his superior to ask what was going on. He was told to just send people home, but more people kept coming. By 9 p.m., the crowd had swelled to thousands, all pressing against the gates, chanting, "Tor off, Tor off, open the gate." Geiger, a loyal Stasi officer, was in an impossible position. He was staring at a huge, peaceful crowd of his own countrymen. He made frantic calls up the chain of command, but no one would give him an order. The leadership had lit the fuse and then vanished. As a desperate half-measure, Geiger's men let a few people through, but stamped their passports in a way that invalidated their citizenship, effectively exiling them. This backfired. The crowd just saw that people were getting through, and they pushed even harder. Geiger knew he was moments away from a deadly stampede. He had to choose between opening fire on thousands of unarmed civilians or defying every order he'd ever been given. At around 11:30 p.m., he made his choice. "We're flooding the gates," he ordered his men, and raised the barrier. The crowd surged forward in a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. They wept, cheered, and were greeted by West Berliners on the other side with champagne and flowers. The same scene played out at checkpoints across the city. Overwhelmed and without orders, the guards just gave up and opened the gates. The wall had been breached not by an army, but by a mistaken announcement and the sheer force of people who simply decided it was over. The resolution and aftermath. A wall crumbles. A nation reunites. The night of November 9th turned into the biggest street party in history. The city of Berlin became one. People who had been separated for nearly 3 decades embraced. They climbed onto the wall at the iconic Brandenburg Gate, dancing and singing on the very symbol of their division. Soon, a new sound filled the air, the tink, tink, tink of hammers and chisels. These Mauerspecht, or wall woodpeckers, began chipping away at the concrete, taking home a piece of history. It was profoundly symbolic. The people themselves were dismantling the barrier with their own hands. The political fallout was total. The East German government collapsed, its authority gone. The push for reunification became unstoppable. Less than a year later, on October 3, 1990, Germany was officially one nation again. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the symbolic death knell of the Cold War. It triggered the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe, and by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself was dissolved. A world order defined by nuclear standoff simply melted away, not with a bang, but with a party in the streets of Berlin, as one person spray painted on a remnant of the wall. Only today is the war really over. So, why did the Berlin Wall fall overnight? It fell because years of courageous, peaceful protest had stripped a decaying regime of its power. It fell because that government, in a moment of panic, tried to release a little pressure and accidentally blew up the whole system. And it fell because one tired, unprepared man fumbled his lines on live television, giving ordinary people the only permission they needed to take back their freedom and change the world forever.